Well, welcome everyone. My name is Travis Hulse. I'm with the Tulsa Planning Office. There's a number of us on here from the Tulsa Planning Office that you'll hear from. We'll also have a chance here at the end to answer any questions that you may have as we go through this tonight. A couple of things before we get started. So first and foremost, thanks for being here. This is the last meeting that we've set up to host and talk about the Neighborhood Infill Overlay, answer any questions that those of you who are most likely to be included within the proposed boundary will have to really learn about the overlay and again, just ask us any questions. So there'll be some additional public meetings coming up with the Planning Commission and City Council that we'll talk about, but we appreciate you being here. We're recording the meeting so that later on you can go back and watch it, or maybe for others who weren't able to attend tonight or one of our other sessions, they'll be able to do that. So this will be made available afterwards. And then this is a webinar format. So I guess what that means is you'll basically be seeing and hearing from members of the Tulsa Planning Office. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you should see an option at the bottom of your screen, maybe top of your screen. You'll see a Q&A. That's the best place to drop those questions and comments rather than using the chat. If you would go ahead and use that Q&A function, that will alert all of the panelists for tonight and keep us a little bit more organized for when we get to the end. So people are muted. You'll again be able to unmute and talk and ask questions if you'd rather do that than submitting them through the Q&A. Just let us know that once we get to that portion here in about 15 minutes by raising your hand. And again, there should be another button that has that hand feature that you can click on to raise and lower. If all else fails, we're kind of monitoring the chat and the Q&A, so we'll work through it together and get started here. So many of you on this call may have heard about the housing study. I'm going to introduce this just briefly because this is largely why we're here talking to you about this specific neighborhood infill overlay. But in 2019, the City of Tulsa commissioned in partnership with other organizations, the Tulsa Development Authority, Downtown Coordinating Council, and Tulsa Planning Office, this housing study to understand really everything about housing in this boundary that you see surrounding downtown. It also included downtown. And a lot went into that. It was primarily a market study, wanting to look at the 10-year housing demand. But more than that, I think it was also asking other questions in addition to the market. What do people support that live in these neighborhoods? What issues and challenges do we see from the development community side of things? What does affordability look like? And then ultimately, what can we do about it all? What are our implementation kind of actions? So one of those actions in front of you is removing barriers to what we call missing middle infill development. So missing middle infill development is really best described by looking at this visual. In Tulsa, we have a lot of detached single family homes here on the left end of the graphic, as well on the far right side, kind of large multi-family apartment complexes. You don't see as much new development for these different housing types that fall kind of in between or in the middle of that spectrum. So that's why you'll often hear this terminology of missing middle housing. It's not to say that there aren't these types in many of your neighborhoods. I think that they do exist. They're just not as prevalent being constructed today as they once were back in the 50s and even previous to that. And so through our efforts in the housing study, but also in this process that we've been going through starting back in May of 2020, we heard a lot about housing choice and affordability, and even this idea of infill development, things that we heard from folks maybe such as yourself who live in these neighborhoods, when it came to housing and what you'd like to see, or at least a component of that. So we started out kind of finalizing that housing study in May, and then we began engaging with the public, launching a survey, having a multitude of conversations to talk about what we're seeing and what we're hearing, and started working through that with the council and planning commission to prepare first what would be the text amendments to the zoning code. So changes to the zoning code that would address many of the barriers that we've identified through this process. And that's gone through in July, was adopted by the city council of this year. So that's a part of the zoning code. Now, the part that we're talking about tonight and kind of that second phase is the application of those standards to a specific geography or a specific neighborhood. So that's what you'll see here mentioned in map amendments in green. That's the phase of the process that we're at. So although we have standards, these have not been applied yet at this point. What we're proposing is that the housing study boundary basically serve as the starting point for what the neighborhood infill overlay boundary would be. So we'll show that to you here and again, but that's where we're kind of at this point, again, engaging with residents and property owners to explain what this overlay is all about, and answering any questions that you may have. Before we get into the overlay specifically, I kind of want to introduce a handful of housing types that we're going to be focusing on specifically. These housing types are in the zoning code and are options in other parts throughout the city of Tulsa. Not many of these options are available in the neighborhoods that we've focused on for this overlay, but this is a part of what the overlay would include. So things like a duplex. A duplex is a building, has 2 units. It could be stacked, one on top, one on the bottom, could be side by side. Typically look very similar to a medium or large scale detached single family home, depending upon how they kind of design and orient those features. Here's a couple renderings and examples of how that might fit in with the scale of the neighborhood, which is an important component of the overlay. Another example, again, that is very similar in scale and size to a detached home is a multi-unit house. The only difference with a multi-unit house is that it contains 3 to 4 dwelling units, and there's only one visible entrance from the street. On duplexes, typically you'd have 2 doors, 2 separate entrances. On a multi-unit house, you only have a single entry point, and the 3 to 4 units are kind of split up on the inside of the structure. The third is apartments and condos. For the purpose of this overlay, when we say apartments, we're talking about up to 8 units. So we would not exceed 8 units. And an apartment simply is a multi-unit structure that all occupies a single lot. And it can be, for this purpose, 3 to 8 units. And style-wise, may look different than what you're seeing here on the screen. This is just an example of an apartment 6-plex here located at 19th and Riverside. This is a cottage house development. Cottage house development we don't see as much of in Tulsa. The cottage house development is really a grouping of smaller detached homes, and they have some sort of kind of shared common space or courtyard. So cottage house developments looking something like this, and how they're arranged again is kind of up to the designer, but typically that's what a cottage house development layout would look like. And then we have townhomes. Townhomes are fairly common, multiple dwelling units, all looks kind of like a single structure because they're typically attached. They have a shared wall, a common wall, but each individual unit is located on a separate lot and has ownership of separate units as well. So townhome is another example of a missing middle type housing that we'll talk more about in this overlay. I'm going to let Nathan get into the details of what the overlay is and what we're proposing as a part of this recommendation to address some of the obstacles and barriers to adding housing choice and housing options to the neighborhood. Again, I'll just encourage people, as you have questions or thoughts come to mind, you don't need to wait for us to stop. You can throw those into the question and answer box at the bottom, and we'll get to those here in just a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Travis. So I'll start just by kind of giving an overview of how this tool works and kind of the origin of it. So when we updated our zoning code back in 2016, the addition of the overlay tool occurred at that time, and we've used it in several instances leading up to this effort, but for different reasons. It's been used to set up design standards along the Arkansas River. It was used to open up signage allowances along Route 66 for neon and other things. So there's other examples, but this is the first we've used it from the housing standpoint. So looking at the priority action that Travis highlighted earlier from the housing study that was completed, one of the main things we noticed was we were standing in the way of the recommendation to try and find areas where these housing types made sense. And the way we were doing that was typically through our zoning ordinance. And if you look at a zoning map of the area that we've shown on the screen right now, you'll see that it's made up of a whole different variation of zoning districts, from single family zoning to multifamily to commercial and other things. This particular overlay would only impact those residentially zoned properties within the area. And what it helps us do is essentially assign a geography and set up a unified set of standards without having to go into individual lots and properties to determine appropriate zoning or change zoning on each lot. Instead, we can set up these standards within the overlay and apply it to the overall geography, and they will take precedence over those underlying standards. This doesn't impact historic preservation zoning, so I think the only one in this current boundary that actually has historic preservation zoning is the Heights. That overlay takes precedent over the overlay that we're talking about, and essentially the zoning code just assigns the most restrictive standard in each of those cases. So in the Heights neighborhood, they're still subject to Preservation Commission approval, design review, and other things, as would be any neighborhood that pursued historic preservation as an option. That would be a tool that could overlay on top of this and provide those additional design restrictions where historic character exists. But when we talked about the overlay, we started to talk about what the specific standards within the zoning code were that created these barriers that we discussed. And on the next slide, it kind of takes you through what those were. So it began with really looking at how we established the purpose for this overlay. Each of these points, I think Travis hit on a little bit when discussing the housing study, but the idea is to really provide a greater affordability for options of housing, additional choices for those that are either looking for a different type of housing or maybe would like to stay in their neighborhood after they decided they don't want a full-blown single-family home anymore, but like their community and like the area they're in, like being near downtown. This would provide those options. So there's more affordable units, there's more expensive units, and the mixture of all of those is what really creates that vibrant neighborhood. But ultimately, it's also about a more efficient use of the public infrastructure that exists within the inner downtown area. The more units we put in this very accessible area, the more people we connect to the downtown core, where jobs are, where young professionals are looking to live, but also connects to a lot of our major assets from a public service perspective, like our BRT line that was recently implemented, as well as services that exist downtown. So there's a lot of options there. When it came to the specific zoning standards that existed, this is a list of those uses that Travis went through in detail, and they were each given different allowances depending on the underlying zoning. So if you were in a district like an RS3 or an RS4 district, you would have been limited to really only exclusively single family homes. By adopting the overlay, what we're doing is opening those other uses up as a matter of right and saying if there's an underdeveloped or underutilized property, it could be utilized for these specific uses. But another barrier that existed within the zoning code was the lot and building regulations that set up how large a lot has to be in order to accommodate those uses. It's worth noting that in most of these areas, the plats and the things that were done, they pre-exist the zoning regulations that we have today. So the result is we have a lot of lots in these neighborhoods that don't conform with the zoning standards we have in place right now. RS3 district, for example, requires a 60-foot wide lot. But if you look at lot patterns in that area, you'll see that a lot of them are actually sub 50 feet. Some are right at 50 feet, and some go even down to like a 40-foot wide lot. So there's a lot of nonconformities that exist today. And by adjusting these lot and building regulations, in addition to adding the opportunities for these other uses, we're also cleaning up some of those nonconformities and allowing people to kind of get away from the issues that present themselves when trying to do any kind of addition or changes to your own lot due to those nonconformities. So the adjustments to the lot and building regulations are done in the same way. It's uniform and it's done throughout that boundary. And we ultimately landed at a 40-foot wide lot with a 4,000 square foot area as minimums within those districts to try and align with what those existing lot patterns were. In addition to the lots themselves and the uses, one of the supporting components of any new development is going to be the parking requirements. So when looking at our zoning code and what it requires today, based on a citywide perspective, it was really determined based on the information we learned in the housing study, as well as many other, our small area plans, our comprehensive plan, and research done in that area, that the parking demands were not aligned with what our parking requirements were. We're really over requiring parking based on the uses that were there. So instead of requiring, 3 or 4 spaces for an apartment unit that goes above 2 bedrooms, we wanted to align our standards to essentially accommodate 1 space per unit within a building. And so that's where the reduction in parking came into play. And we think it fits closer with those standards and those demands in the areas that we're talking about. It also prevents the need for new developments and other things or even just the rehabilitation of an existing structure, like an apartment building, to utilize additional lots and green space and areas for the purpose of only parking. Parking can be fairly disruptive to that neighborhood character. And so we want to limit the impact that has on the neighborhood while also still requiring what we believe is an appropriate amount of parking. It's worth noting these are minimums. Any new development can obviously opt to build more parking if they desired, if they have a demand for more, or if they feel like they need more. This just makes sure that we're not over requiring in those instances where we know the market doesn't need as many parking spaces. The final piece of this that's included in the overlay is, as we were making these changes to allow the additional use types, we're aware there's plenty of single family homes in the area that will remain moving forward. And currently all of those lots would be restricted from adding an additional dwelling unit in their backyard, for example, like an accessory dwelling unit or a garage apartment. And we have standards for those in our code. So while allowing these additional units within the neighborhood, we felt it was also important to make sure that as a single family homeowner, you now have the opportunity to build those accessory dwelling units as a matter of right, instead of the additional special exceptions and requirements for relief that may have been needed before. They still follow all the same size regulations and placement regulations for accessory buildings. There's no additions to that or exemptions of that, but it does allow it to avoid having to go through that special exception process. All of the uses that we're talking about also still follow the same height requirements as a single family home. So the difference here is really that rather than seeing just one new single family home built to the max building envelope at 35 feet tall, you could potentially accommodate additional units within that space, and these uses then become that option. So those are the changes that the overlay proposes. The boundary that we've shown is going to the Planning Commission with our recommendation in September. So that's the notice of the hearing that all of you received. That September 15th meeting will be the first public hearing on the matter before the decision-making authority, which will be the Planning Commission. They'll make a recommendation to City Council, who makes the final decision about the adoption of this overlay, as well as the geography of that boundary and which neighborhoods are included. Given the track that this is on right now, we expect that in early next year, these would likely go into effect based on that approval and based on that process that it goes through with TMAPC and the City Council. On the next slide, we really wanted to offer up our information. This is the contact information for Travis, myself, and Susan, who you've heard from tonight. So it's a good resource for you all if you have additional questions leading up to that hearing. It's worth noting that for a little bit of time, I'm going to be gone in the midst of this. So I will have obviously responses that set up who else to talk to, and Travis and Susan can be contacts for you all in that time. But this is our contact information so that we can be reached for questions. But I also would definitely advise everyone take a look at the website that's linked on the right side of the screen at tulsaplanning.org/housing. It's a really good resource for the overlay itself. It provides you with all the details of the overlay, including the code language that's been adopted and what we're asking to apply. And there's an interactive map, so it will show you in proximity to the overlay where your property is located, whether it's in or out of the proposed boundary. So I would definitely recommend using that website as a resource. So I think we're going to begin to answer some of the questions. I think Susan's kind of been answering some just with text responses as we've gone, but it does look like we have a few plugged in here. So I will go ahead and I guess just open it up, and Travis and I can field these questions.
So the questions that I answered, does everyone get to see those, or do we need to read over those in case people have the same questions?
Yeah, you might want to read over them just to be safe, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Chrissy had a question that I think I talked about just at that very last segment, which is there a height restriction on the 8 units? That is yes. It's still limited to a 35-foot height maximum, which is the same as would apply to any single family home built in the area. We didn't adjust that height standard at all. I haven't read this second question yet.
You want to cover it, Susan?
Okay, yeah, let me get there, see it. The second one was, how are historic neighborhoods being considered, specifically Tracy Park? She talks about how it was established in the 1920s. It's single family residential in characters, just as specified the deed restrictions, largely through efforts of strong homeowners associations reinforced by the strong boundaries forming a barrier between the district and other neighborhoods with businesses and multifamily dwellings intruding. So she says it's the only intact 1920s single family residential neighborhood in Tulsa, which is not intruded by commercial or residential. So we've been having a bit of conversation in our office about Tracy Park and Owen Park, and just maybe the unique nature of both of these, in that they are both on the National Register of Historic Places. So the one thing, and I don't know, and we've been through so many of these meetings, I can't remember if we've said this in this one, but the purpose of this meeting and all of these meetings really is to get feedback from the neighborhoods as to who should be included in the overlay. So when the council initiated this boundary, it wasn't a hard and fast boundary. It was really the place to start. We can't expand it, but we can definitely pull it in. And so that's what we're here to talk about. And I don't know if we've gotten to the very last slide that shows how we need to gather information about whether you support or oppose this overlay in your neighborhood. But this is going to help us inform decision makers. We'll go to the Planning Commission and then City Council about who is in support and not, and what might make sense. And I know Travis and I talked about this in the office today. Not really with Nathan yet, so this is news to him maybe. But we're really going to take that map and try to craft some alternative recommendations as we go to the Planning Commission based on the feedback that we have, not just we recommend the boundary of the downtown overlay period. It's just that, you know, that's one way to look at it. Also, if you take into account the feedback we received in the neighborhood, the wishes of the neighborhood, then this would be what we recommended. So the process is, and the code actually requires that we do this as part of the information we share. We need, and this can be really simple, just an email to esubmit@incog.org. We do need it really by Friday. It just needs to be really simple. But we need it by Friday just so that we can include it on the map that needs to go in the information that we send out to the Planning Commission.
Very quick
indicating support or opposition. Provide your name and address. That's how we map it, is by knowing where your address. Indicate if you support or oppose the overlay, and then of course, if you could attend the meeting on the 15th. If you can, I mean, we're still going to have this information and bring it forward, but that will be very helpful to see a general understanding of the neighborhood support, because decision makers typically are not going to want to impose an overlay or any type of restrictions on your neighborhood that is not supported by the neighborhood.
While you were answering that, Susan, I went ahead and just clicked that we were answering Jeffrey's first question here regarding the formal process and deadlines for opposition. So that really, on this slide, that covers everything as far as what you'll need to do and what you would need to provide to us in order to make that known, hopefully by Friday, so we can make sure we get that in the packet we send on to the planning commissioners. To Lori's question, the boundary was really established by the housing study. That was the area that was undertaken by the consultant in the city originally, and it was where we saw those needs. So that's where the research indicated, there was a demand for these types of housing. And so that was kind of where we started, was from that boundary. And as Susan described, it's really just that. It's a starting point. It's something for us to go, hey, this is where we have the most information. It's where we had done really the most research to understand what that market was. And it's kind of where we had existing recommendations to make some of those changes. So that's how that initial boundary was established.
Do you want to answer that next one as well, Nathan?
Sure.
Talking about the character overlay.
So the question is regarding neighbors. I'll just read it. Some of my neighbors oppose the overlay. Others, like myself, support it for reasons that you're describing. One shared area of concern is a fear that McMansion-style houses might start popping up in the neighborhood. It's a different issue than the city is addressing here, but would it be possible to couple this overlay with a character overlay for new single-family homes? So it's definitely something that's possible. It's a conversation that has already kind of begun with several neighborhoods in town regarding the idea of some kind of character overlay. The tool itself is pretty versatile in the way it can be applied. It has to meet certain requirements, and as well as there's two different ways of initiating it. If a neighborhood wants to initiate something like this, they have to provide consent from all of the owners that would be included. But also if it's something that's driven by the city council or by others, it could be initiated through that process like the overlay we're doing here would be. But yes, it's definitely possible to have multiple overlays. And this actually kind of segues nicely into Chrissy's question that was next, which was about how a historic overlay could exist on top of the infill overlay. The zoning code prescribes when there are multiple overlays in place that the most restrictive standard would be the one we go to. With the historic preservation overlay, that would by far be the more restrictive thing. It subjects all new development, be it duplex, townhouse, apartment, single family home, to the criteria of the Preservation Commission. It would require approval of the design through the Preservation Commission before permits could be built, and a certificate of appropriateness for that neighborhood based on the process it would have to go through. So in the same vein, a character overlay mentioned by Matt would essentially provide the same. If there were more restrictive standards for design or for construction within a character overlay, it would go on top of this overlay for the infill program and allow those additional standards to still be applied. And so that's why places like the Heights, where there is existing historic preservation zoning, for example, they would still be subject to all of those standards they are today. Another question here for ADUs, for the piece on ADUs by right, for those residents that already have ADUs, why does this matter? Well, for one, the existing ADUs in Tulsa today mostly exist through a legal non-conforming status. So they're essentially grandfathered into the codes we have today because of how restrictive our code is on those existing structures. So by changing it and saying these are actually allowed by right, it does remove at least one layer of that non-conforming status with regard to the use by saying that's a fully permitted and allowable use within the neighborhood. Some of those buildings that pre-exist the code might still have issues with setbacks or height or things like that, but with regard to use itself, it actually cleans up at least some of that for you if there were ever needs to make changes to that existing unit. You wouldn't be subject to going through the Board of Adjustment for approval or anything like that.
I'll take the question about whether or not the city's performed a tax feasibility study on how the neighborhood infill overlay would affect privately owned homes and other tax implications, as well as infrastructure, power, water, sewer lines. Is there enough power to supply the zoned area? So to answer the first part, the city has not performed a tax feasibility study, nor do we fully understand how this zoning might impact tax implications and otherwise. We talked about that a little bit at one of our community meetings last week, and there's a balance there where, you know, the increase in property values is a good thing on the one hand, that value of your home is going up. On the other hand, I don't know that any of us would say we like to pay more taxes necessarily. So understanding that typically home values have just historically been increasing over time, it's hard to say how much of an impact the adoption of the neighborhood infill overlay would have on that specifically. And then for serving from an infrastructure standpoint, a lot of these neighborhoods were previously even built out more than they are today, where you have a lot of vacant land that was previously occupied by a home is no longer occupied. And most of our infrastructure was really set up to support that fully built out neighborhood. So in our conversations with city departments over water and sewer and other infrastructure, that's never been a concern that's been brought up from a capacity standpoint. So I think that we would anticipate our existing infrastructure being able to serve these areas without, you know, any concerns or issues there.
So the next question said, would this also eliminate a need for some variances? Yeah, it certainly would. We've seen, you know, even just from a duplex standpoint, as an example, a few different projects have come up where someone wanted to build a duplex in one of these neighborhoods, but those lot and building regulations I mentioned earlier were too restrictive, and they said that a duplex couldn't be built unless you had a 75-foot wide lot and 9,000 square feet of lot area. And so ultimately that led to the need for some relief or even rezonings in those situations, which were pretty extended processes that come with their own cost as well as time. So by adjusting those lot and building regulations, I think we've put people in a position to be able to utilize those lots that exist in some of these neighborhoods and avoid that need for additional relief, just because they would now align better with the zoning code and with the anticipated use of some of those lots.
So I'll answer the next one. So how can a neighborhood outside of the original housing study be added to the overlay? Is there an overlay amendment process after it is adopted this year? And is there still a way to get a neighborhood added prior to its adoption this year? So let me see the order of those questions. So right now, the boundary, as I said, we have, the council has initiated the boundary. We have provided all the notice that we need to get to the Planning Commission hearing on September 15th with that boundary. So we have not met noticing requirements for a larger boundary or anything outside of that. So so right now, the you know, moving forward, it can't be with this proposal. However, it is a zoning change. And people always have the ability to submit a request or a zoning application to be included in an overlay. So that's absolutely a possibility, regardless of the overlay. There are some, it needs to be at least, if it's not contiguous to an overlay, it needs to be, I think it's at least 10 lots or an acre or something like that. There's a bit of a size limitation there. So yes, there's no way to get a neighborhood added prior to adoption of this one, but it could definitely, once the text is in effect, which is tomorrow. So once that is in place, people can submit really tomorrow for any type of inclusion in the overlay.
I'll answer the next question, asking about input being only for those living within these areas, within the proposed overlay. So the zoning code, as it reads for the overlay and for this process that we're going through, is that we will submit a map with this item at the September 15th public hearing that shows those who are in support and those who are in opposition of the proposed overlay. Living within these boundaries is kind of the prerequisite for that. That's what I think the planning commissioners and counselors will want to consider. The one thing that I will add is the zoning code does specify property owners. However, we feel like regardless of being a property owner versus a tenant, living in this neighborhood is really the qualification. So even if you're not a property owner, but you live in this neighborhood, we'd still want to hear from you so that we can include that within that map and within our report that will show those of you who are in support or in opposition of the overlay.
So to Jennifer's question, the historic overlay comes with more restrictions than we may need. We just might want to opt out. Is that our only option? So like we mentioned earlier, there are options for other character type overlays. There's quite a bit of things that have to go into that, including a certain level of consent from the neighborhood. There would need to be at least some sort of initiation or justification from our standpoint if it was going to be initiated by the city. But there are other tools. They wouldn't at this point be able to happen at the same time just because of the point in the process this overlay is on, but it is something that may come up. It's worth noting that even today, within these neighborhoods that don't have that HP zoning, for example, that new single family homes could be constructed that don't match character standards or even what the historic character of the neighborhood is, that the register only provides that kind of as it's a register or a list of where these historically significant neighborhoods are. And it's why we often promote historic preservation to those neighborhoods to ensure that if there is a desire to maintain that historic character, that they seek that protection that historic preservation provides. But we do understand there's often challenges with neighborhoods in finding any sort of consent. So it's always worth reaching out to our office just to discuss what might be possible or available. Susan, you queued up?
Yeah, let me answer Matt's question. So Matt asked, what are the 2 to 3 biggest impacts that the city's planning office thinks this overlay will have for the city of Tulsa 1 to 2 decades in the future? How do you think these zoning changes will impact the downtown and downtown adjacent communities? So first of all, I'll say, I think it will provide options we don't currently have, which opens up really potentially a whole new type of population, whether it be a generation or just preferences. I mean, trends are definitely changing in what people want in their housing. So options is one. Hopefully affordability, just by the nature of a smaller unit, potentially is going to be more affordable than a larger one. Another thing is increasing densities in those areas, which helps those areas be more vibrant and sustainable over time. And the interesting thing that I've learned recently is that Midtown and parts of sort of the center of the city really lost population in the census. And that is a little, a little hard to understand because there's a lot of stuff going on, but there's a lot of trading out one house for another house and one house for another house versus really trying to find a way to bring more people down. We want retail, we want grocery stores, we want all of that stuff in downtown and near the downtown area, but they are not going to locate unless more people live there. So it's really trying to find ways to be consistent and to maintain those really important, cool old neighborhoods and maintain that character, but also find ways to integrate density that's appropriate for those neighborhoods. I don't know if anything I've missed there, Nathan or Travis.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, I think that the housing study was really key in that and in providing that, I mean, really putting a number on this shortage of units that exist today, and us understanding that trends are changing. Demand for housing is changing for all demographics. What people want or where people want to live is certainly something that we're trying to adapt to, and it's really becoming important to be able to connect people to that downtown area where most are wanting to locate. So yeah, I think this is a good opportunity to try and increase that supply, to open up that choice and create more vibrancy where there is some already.
This next question is, I think, pretty straightforward. The question is, if Tracy Park neighborhood were to pursue a historic overlay, which specifically I'm understanding that to be the historic preservation zoning overlay that's available in the city, would you need to establish a design review committee, or would the Historic Preservation Office solely dictate design choices and renovations? So the Tulsa Preservation Commission is who would review those applications were Tracy Park to be rezoned and apply the historic preservation zoning overlay. So the current HP design guidelines, the historic preservation design guidelines that are in place would dictate what would be allowed and what would be reviewed by the Tulsa Preservation Commission. So there would not need to be a new committee.
So also each neighborhood has their own set of design guidelines. So it would be a process if that's something the neighborhood wanted to really weigh into what you would want that to be. But again, it would need to be, there's, a preservation sort of focus, and then like Nathan's working on for another neighborhood, really a template for a neighborhood character overlay, which is really a bit of a different focus than an actual preservation effort.
So I'm not sure that I understand exactly this next question, but I'll read it. And then if you want to follow up with clarification, I apologize if I'm missing the point here, but the question is, the historic Greenwood District area, as we know, has a mix of regular family homes with giant yards. Is our area being zoned only to bring knowledge as owners, just in case we might want to sell our property or rebuild the style of homes you're representing? And then the example is that the home is on a 3/4 acre lot. So what is being proposed with the overlay could potentially go a couple of ways. So I think we've seen the neighborhood infill overlay is really providing options for new development on lots that are vacant, or even in cases where we have some abandoned, dilapidated structures. It would be a benefit to the community if a property owner were to utilize the neighborhood infill overlay to build something new and get rid of that structure that was abandoned or otherwise uninhabitable. I think that's our primary hope with the neighborhood infill overlay. If a current owner, and in this situation, was interested to develop something differently, being that you have a a single family home with a fairly large lot, then yes, you could do that. And the neighborhood infill overlay would, again, just provide other housing options that could be built or developed. So either option is potential throughout the areas that would be included in the overlay boundary. I think that our first kind of, I don't want to say preference maybe, but intent of the neighborhood overlay is really more geared towards infill where we have vacant lots and building on those. So if I didn't answer that question exactly the way that you're asking, please feel free to clarify and just add another question in the box.
I'm just gonna say, these are the best questions that we've we've heard. These are really good. These are really thoughtful questions. You guys have done some thinking about it.
I can take a stab at the next question. Owen Park, another 1920s historic neighborhood, many homes built without garages or off-street parking. Already fire trucks and ambulance struggle to get past parked cars on very narrow streets. Has the study considered the safety aspect of additional cars up to 2 extra per unit of new builds blocking passage? We had conversations leading up to this proposal with the city streets and stormwater department to discuss what those impacts have been, where they're aware of those existing issues. And really it comes down to ultimately determining where those problems exist today and determining like where restrictions on parking can be placed to prevent that blocking. If problems exist today, I don't anticipate that this makes problems worse. If there is a problem with passage, it really comes down to trying to get restrictions on where those parking places can be along the street. And I think that our streets and stormwater department is fairly responsive in those situations when there is known issues and there has been problems to marking one side without parking. It's been kind of reactive because obviously there's a lot of streets in the city that they have to deal with, but it is something that we considered, and we don't believe that just by maintaining at least a requirement for on-street parking, or I'm sorry, off-street parking with each new construction or new proposal, we think we're meeting the needs for those developments. And like I mentioned earlier, it is minimums, so there is always the opportunity that more parking will be built. I think most of us probably, if we are someone who has a car and we rely on it, when we're looking for a housing option, we want to be able to find somewhere that it can accommodate that. So it kind of dictates where that might end up being, but also allows that flexibility where it's needed to ensure that existing buildings can be brought back to life without the need for additional parking or the more intrusion into the neighborhood. But yeah, I think overall we did look at that. We talked to the folks that are involved, and we determined we didn't think that the change we made would have that impact on those areas. To Chrissy's next question, are you going for that one, Travis, or?
Go ahead.
So it would depend on how big that half lot is. If it were a 45-foot wide, or I'm sorry, a 40-foot wide area with 4,000 square feet of area, without potentially throwing the other building out of compliance or conformance that's located next to it, then there could be an establishment of a new lot there, and that would be considered. But that's the baseline. So 40 feet wide and 4,000 square feet is required to establish a lot of any kind.
Did you see her
Nathan.
edit a couple down?
Yeah.
Edit,
Half lot is owned by-
the half
okay.
lot is owned by deed.
So it would, again, still depend on the size relating to how that would be treated. But even if it were already an existing deeded lot on its own deed today, it would still qualify for some non-conforming provisions to be utilized as a lot. But really all just depends on the size and the proposal, whether or not it could be utilized for the uses we've talked about. So.
Next question is, I think, a good question, and that is, how does the city, and in this case, even our office, the Tulsa Planning Office, know that the neighborhood infill overlay zoning will work with these chosen boundaries? The comment is that just because an area is low on housing doesn't mean to locate all multifamily all in one area or in historical neighborhoods. And then there's a reference to looking at west and south area of Tulsa, where there's high burglary and crime rates along with low income. So to kind of answer the question, if you remember earlier in the presentation, I think that very question, I think, was at the forefront of at least my mind, and the group as a whole. We don't necessarily want to create this, creative name and this idea for missing middle housing if it's not actually going to be utilized. So that's why we had conversations with developers in the community, and these are local developers, to ask them that question, to know what types of challenges that they face, so that from a financing side of things and banking and lending and all of that, is that possible? Is this something that could be done with the cost of land and a lot of those other things? We looked at it from a zoning perspective. So from our perspective, I think we've covered those bases in addressing what barriers were in existence and are in existence today, previous to the overlay standards being applied. And then I think in general conversation again with members of the neighborhoods, residents of these neighborhoods, wanting to know if there's support for it. So I think those are kind of the three key components of answering the question of how do we know that it will even work. To be totally honest, we don't know that when this overlay is adopted that people are just going to start building these homes tomorrow. We haven't had those conversations. Nobody's told us that that's their intent. But our hope is that certainly people will see the value in the overlay, opening up some of those housing options. So I don't anticipate this being, the intent of this being to locate multifamily exclusively into existing neighborhoods. I think most of these neighborhoods are already single family detached homes. And so it would be adding to that, providing more of a diversity in housing options and choice. So where we can see some of those benefits from housing, like I said, just housing choice in general. So
you want me to answer the question from Jennifer?
sure.
What percentage of the neighborhood would have to agree for the historic preservation overlay to be considered and adopted? Okay. Okay. I'm going to try not to sound too terribly technical here, but so if the neighborhood were to submit an application on their own for a historic preservation overlay, any application that is submitted has to have 100% consent in our office to be submitted to our office. However, one avenue, just like this neighborhood infill overlay, may be that the city councilor of the district that you're in may want to ask that the entirety of the city council initiate that on your behalf. That doesn't require 100% consent to get it started. And then throughout that, if that would be a way that your neighborhood would want to go, and then it would just need to kind of play out to understand who in the neighborhood, if there was a general consensus, maybe there's a part of the neighborhood that's interested and not. So that would play out. But generally, if you submit the application, everyone has to consent. The city council can get it started on their own. And there's no final number at the end of the process that says, we're not going to adopt this unless 100% of you are in agreement. The council could say that for sure. There's just not that requirement in the zoning code.
Okay, the next question. My business is located in the overlay area, so it sounds like a business owner. If you did not want business input, why did I receive a notice of this hearing? So hopefully I didn't say that, and I apologize if I did. We want to hear from all property owners. So regardless of if you're a business owner or a homeowner, if you own property or if you are a tenant living in these areas, we'd want to hear from you. So everyone received the notice who owns property within the proposed boundary, and then also 300 feet outside of that boundary. So it was a little over 5,000 notices, I believe, that went out, so quite a few. In addition to the homeowners and businesses, they affect each other. My neighborhood is in decline with houses in disrepair, some vacant lots, or homeless people occupying abandoned homes and alleyways. This very much affects both my business and the homeowners, bringing crime, gangs, and tagging in my area. I would really like to see this neighborhood revitalized. It would be good for all concerned. So I'll just add that I think we wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, that residential, commercial, all uses impact and affect one another. And our focus with housing and with neighborhoods, I think, is just one component of that. So how those can kind of play off of each other and help to stabilize and revitalize, as you say, neighborhoods is definitely one of the outcomes, positive outcomes that we would see with this neighborhood infill overlay.
Okay, so for question from Chrissy, she says the boundaries of Tracy Park include various commercial lots as well. And would it be possible to partition the Tracy Park neighborhood? Basically, could the overlay cover the lot south of 13th on the west side of Peoria, but not cover Norfolk, Newport, and Owasso bordered by 11th and 13th? Okay, just because we know we talked today, I think I know what you mean, and the answer is yes. You can definitely, because it's kind of, that's just the way I pick, it's sort of that core, not to the south and not to the, I believe, east, which are those commercial lots. Honestly, I don't know what those are zoned. So, I mean, it's the neighborhood infill overlay is really only going to benefit those if they're zoned residential, even, I don't know. So Nathan, do you know what the zoning is on like that commercial that is in between Tracy Park and say Peoria? And even the zoning that is on the other side, on south of 13th of Tracy Park?
I'm not sure, but I do think it is primarily commercial along Peoria there.
Yeah.
Looks like CH going 13th all the way up to 11th place, with the exception of Tracy Park being the park itself being residentially zoned. Everything around Owasso, Newport, and Norfolk are RS3 zoning. So the commercial lots that front along Peoria along that boundary really wouldn't have any benefit unless they later rezoned to some kind of residential or something of that nature. The commercial zoning is not impacted, and that may have been what led to the misinterpretation earlier, Travis, about not wanting input from commercial owners. Mm-hmm. That was certainly not the intent if I said it either, but what I was really explaining is just that commercial zoning is not changed by this. So there's no difference, whether this is adopted or not on those commercial properties. What they would be allowed to do would be no different based on adoption than what they can do today. So I don't know that it would make too much sense to just get the Peoria corridor within the overlay. But yeah, certainly something to discuss in terms of whether or not Tracy Park is totally interested.
So what about south of 13th Street there, just south of Tracy Park?
So there's 3 residentially zoned lots on that south side before you get to the highway that sit right behind those buildings fronting on Peoria. Mm-hmm. So each of those would benefit. I mean, if someone determined they wanted to build something on any of those, I'm not sure if those are privately owned or if ODOT owns any of that property in that area, but regardless, it's zoned residentially with the exception of a parking zoning that exists on the far south and would benefit from the overlay if it were included. So.
And I guess I'll just say something too about notice. So we send out notice not only to potentially affected property owners that may have a zoning change, but everyone within 300 feet, because we understand that there are potential impacts of changing zoning on adjacent neighbors. So we, in fact, when someone comes into our office and submits an application, we really only send it to, we don't need to send it to the person that gave us the application, but to everyone around it. So we always want to hear, because we hear a lot of things from adjacent property owners and impacts and issues that we, even though like we may be familiar with the area, but we don't live there, we don't have business there. So all of that input is helpful to us to get a better understanding of what's going on in that area.
I think you just answered the question a couple down. Do you want to answer this next one about the percentage of the neighborhood? I know you've given that some thought, Susan. We've talked about that a little bit.
I mean, there's interesting. Okay, there's not a percentage that is required necessarily. It's not a, it's not a black and white kind of thing there. There's a lot of gray in there, but I know that once we see what that map looks like, I feel like we definitely need to lay out what those options are. And even, I've even asked someone to kind of put a map together of, for instance, the National Register districts and the infill overlay boundary, just to kind of see how all these things come together and to see what might make sense to have as a recommendation, as an alternative recommendation to the Planning Commission, if they want, and is there some kind of boundary that makes sense based on the sentiments of the residents, and maybe part of the neighborhood's different and they want to take advantage of the overlay, and maybe there are more lots in a certain part of the neighborhood that would want it. We definitely, absolutely don't want any historic homes or any homes torn down that still have the chance of being there and being part of that neighborhood. So anyway, there's no real clear answer to that. I think that's just something that we want to get as much information on it and convey that in the most helpful way we can as we go through the process.
I think that question, I live just a few feet from the edge of these neighborhoods, and support, would my comment and support be given consideration living just outside the boundary? Certainly, we would encourage anyone who received notice to provide us with feedback. We're, like we said, we're going to show where that feedback came from, so it just associates that there is support in the area for the proposal. So I think it is important for anyone who received a notice and who is interested to provide us with some feedback. So to Jennifer's question, there's plenty of land for building in and around Tulsa. We moved here. Denver has been seeing something like this that eventually removes historic neighborhoods as investors move in and attempt to make a buck. How can you ensure investors don't take over? So I think that plays to a lot of the points we've made earlier regarding pursuing other avenues for those historic neighborhoods on preservation, trying to gain a zoning restriction on that historic character is something that provides a really large benefit to a historic neighborhood and protecting that character. Like we mentioned, some of these areas aren't even on that zoning yet, so there's not really any protection there. I don't think that the changes we're making necessarily prompt an immediate just surge of new investment and developers coming in and doing anything. There is quite a bit of multifamily zoned property within the boundary we're utilizing. We're just adjusting some of the lot restrictions on those. And in the past, there's not been a massive, uptick in those properties being developed when they already could have been some of these uses. This just does set up a better foundation for moving forward to match some of the growth we see over time, and ensures that those options are available where they do make sense. Understanding, obviously, Tulsa's got a very large geography, but a big part of this is trying to not just create a housing supply, but also make sure that it's well located, make sure that it has access to the things people who maybe don't want a car would have, and also ensuring that we're utilizing that existing space instead of continuing to spread our footprint and build more infrastructure that then becomes responsibility and the maintenance of the taxpayer over time. We're spread out pretty wide right now, and those liabilities are expensive. So the more we can utilize the things that we have enter to our city and that exist today, the better off we are financially, but also environmentally. It reduces travel times for people who work downtown and want to live near downtown, prevents traffic congestion in areas where people would otherwise be driving. So there's a lot of benefits to that added density, and it makes more sense for that to occur in that downtown core area than it does in a lot of places. But as we mentioned earlier, this is obviously just a pilot. This could be duplicated. If another neighborhood feels like it makes sense where they are, this effort could be mimicked, and we could apply these standards in areas other than just the downtown core. We're operating now off of what work we've done in this area and the engagement that we've done leading up to this. And so we felt like this was the most appropriate place to start.
This is a little different. Nathan and I were talking today about, because Nathan and I live in Brookside, and I definitely, as new construction, people tear down homes, and I'm thinking about my street, and I would say for every one house that's torn down and replaced, there's probably another 3 houses that are really significantly renovated and kind of brought back to life. So I think that you'll see that happens in a neighborhood too, when just there starts to be renewed interest. So we definitely don't want to see homes come down, but to see renewed interest in neighborhoods is a good thing for sure.
So that's all the questions that we've had. We'll maybe give it a little bit. Sometimes people will think of something else now that we've been talking for a little while you want to ask. Go ahead and put that in there. If there aren't any, then we can kind of move on. I'll put the slide back up here just for a moment while we're waiting to see if there's any other questions about how to get your feedback to us. So again, we'll be accepting, I guess, for lack of a better word, your written indication of support or opposition. So if you received a notice, if you're living inside the boundary or nearby, if you're a business owner or a homeowner, if you're a tenant, please submit to us at that esubmit@incog.org. We'll stay organized that way. You're also encouraged and welcome to come to the public hearing and state that same support or opposition if you'd like to in front of the Planning Commission on September 15th at 1 p.m. at City Hall. And if you go to the project webpage, we have all the details about the meetings and anything else that you might want to research and learn about. That was right here, tulsaplanning.org/housing. So I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. Any other concluding thoughts from the group? Susan, Nathan, Councilor Hall Harper?
Just I appreciate the questions.
Yeah, like I said, these were the best questions, I think, of the collection. And it might be just because all the neighborhoods are sort of coming together here. But so as I think Travis or Nathan said, really, as far as the contact information, I would in that page, I would focus on probably Travis and I, since Nathan will be going to Hawaii in a couple of days. So yeah, let us know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we really hope that you send us an email at esubmit if you do have an opinion about either supporting or opposing the neighborhood or the overlay for your neighborhood.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and call it a night. Thank you again, everyone, for coming, and we'll be hopefully hearing from you soon. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you, Counselor, for coming.
No problem. Have a good one.